Herbstlinden, a small town in Lower Saxony, September 2019. Margarete Hoffmann had always been known in Herbstlinden as the woman who couldn't say no to anyone who needed help. At 73, with her neatly combed grey hair and a gentle smile that won over everyone, she was the kind of person who made a point of bringing homemade soup to sick neighbours and never missed a charity campaign without contributing. Her house on Lindenstrasse, a traditional two-story German building with a well-kept garden, had become too big since her husband Werner passed away 3 years earlier. Her children, Christian and Petra, lived far away. He in Hamburg, she in Munich, and only visited on holidays. Margaret had grown accustomed to the silence, but not to the loneliness. It was on a grey September afternoon, while shopping at the local market, that Margaret first heard about the new wave of refugees who had arrived in the region. Herr Schneider, the bakery owner, was talking to other customers about the difficulties the city was facing in accommodating the families. "We don't have enough infrastructure," he said, shaking his head, "and the temporary shelter is overcrowded. Some of these people are sleeping on the floor." Margaret listened silently, nervously fiddling with the handle of her shopping bag. That night she could hardly sleep. She kept thinking about Herr Schneider's words, imagining entire families without a proper place to shelter. Werner always said she had too big a heart for her own good, but Margaret believed that helping others was simply the right thing to do. The next morning, she went to the Municipal Social Services office. It was a modest building with concrete walls and hallways that echoed her footsteps. The employee who attended to her, Frau Keller, seemed surprised when Margaret explained that she wanted to volunteer to take in refugees. "Are you sure?" asked Frau Keller, adjusting her glasses. "This is not a decision to be made on impulse. We are talking about people who have been through severe trauma, with different cultures and languages." "I'm sure," Margaret replied with determination. "My house is big, I have spare rooms, and, well, I need to feel useful again." Frau Keller explained the process. There would be a background check, a home visit to assess the conditions of the house, and they would try to find someone who was compatible with her profile. Margaret signed all the necessary papers, feeling a mixture of nervousness and purpose she hadn't experienced in a long time. 2 weeks later, Frau Keller called. "We have someone who may be suitable for you," she said. "He is a 34-year-old man from Turkey. He arrived 3 months ago with valid refugee papers. He speaks a little German and English, is polite, and has reportedly lost his family in conflicts in the region. His name is Mehmet Özkan." Margaret carefully wrote down all the information. Mehmet would be her first guest. They would meet the following Friday. That October morning, Margaret woke up earlier than usual. She cleaned the whole house again, prepared the guest room with fresh sheets and flowers from the garden, and cooked a traditional sauerbraten. She wanted Mehmet to feel welcome. When the doorbell rang at 2 p.m. sharp, Margaret took a deep breath before opening the door. Standing before her was a man of medium height, with dark, neatly cut hair and a precisely trimmed beard. He wore simple but clean clothes, a dark blue shirt and jeans. His brown eyes were expressive, and when he smiled, Margaret immediately felt she had made the right decision. "Frau Hoffmann?" he said with a slight accent, extending his hand. "Ich bin Mehmet. Vielen Dank. Thank you for your hospitality." His German was hesitant but understandable. Margaret showed him around the house, showing him the bedroom, the bathroom, the kitchen. Mehmet asked polite questions, admiring the antique furniture and family photographs. When he saw Werner's photo on the sideboard in the living room, he bowed his head respectfully. "Your husband?" he asked in English. Margareta confirmed this, explaining that he had passed away a few years ago. Mehmet placed his hand on his heart. "I'm sorry. He seems to have been a good man." During dinner, Mehmet told his story. He spoke slowly, mixing German, English, and a few expressive gestures. He had been a teacher in Ankara, but the political situation had deteriorated. His wife and young daughter had been killed in an explosion. He showed a faded photo he carried in his wallet. He managed to escape, but lost everything. Margaret listened with tears in her eyes. She served another portion of sauerbraten and insisted that he eat. "You're home now," she said, gently touching his arm. "Everything will be fine." That night, after Mehmet had retired to his room, Margaret called her daughter Petra. "Mom, are you sure this is a good idea?" Petra asked, concerned. "You don't even know this man very well. He lost his family, Petra. Imagine the suffering he went through. And he's so polite, so grateful. He reminds me of your father when he was young." Petra sighed on the other end of the line. "Just be careful, okay? And if anything strange happens, call me immediately." Margaret agreed, but in her heart she knew there was nothing to worry about. Mehmet seemed genuinely grateful and respectful. Finally, after so much time alone, she had someone to care for again. What Margaret didn't know was that at that very moment, 2 floors above, Mehmet was not sleeping. He sat in the darkness of the room, watching the quiet street of Herbstlinden through the window, a small smile on his lips. He picked up a cell phone, not the one he had shown the authorities, but a second device, and typed a message in Turkish. "I'm in. The old lady is perfect. Lonely, trusting, with money. Let's start phase 2. The reply came in seconds. "Excellent, proceed as planned. Remember, patience is everything." Mehmet deleted the messages, hid the phone in a secret compartment in his suitcase, and finally lay down. Tomorrow his new life as a refugee would officially begin. A life that, if everything went according to plan, would be very lucrative. Downstairs, Margaret fell asleep with a smile on her face, happy to be helping someone who really needed it. She had no way of knowing that she had just opened her home and her life to a predator who had turned German hospitality into an exact science of manipulation and profit. The full moon illuminated Lindenstrasse, and little Herbstlinden slept peacefully, unaware that in one of its most respectable houses a dangerous game had just begun. The first few weeks of living together passed like a dream for Margaret. Mehmet proved to be the ideal guest she never imagined she would have. He woke up early, always greeted her with a warm smile, and insisted on helping with the housework, even when she protested that it wasn't necessary. "Please, Frau Margarete," he would say, using an affectionate version of her name that made her smile. "You have given me a home. It's the least I can do." Mehmet had an organized routine. He would leave in the morning for his German classes at the community center and for meetings with the social worker. In the afternoon, when he returned, he always brought small gifts: flowers from the market, Turkish sweets from a shop in Hanover, or special tea that he said reminded him of his homeland. "My grandmother always said that shared tea creates family ties," he explained, preparing the aromatic drink in a small ceremony that delighted Margaret. Family. Family isn't just blood, it's who takes care of you. Margaret was moved by these displays of affection. She hadn't felt so needed, so valued in years. Mehmet asked about her life, listened attentively to her stories about Werner, about her children, about Herbstlinden. He showed genuine interest in everything, or so it seemed. What Margaret didn't realize was the surgical precision with which Mehmet gathered information. When she casually mentioned that Werner had left her a good retirement fund, he asked subtle questions about financial security in Germany. When she showed him photos of her children, he carefully observed the details: Christian's expensive clothes, Petra's elegant apartment, the signs that the Hoffman family had substantial resources. "Your children are very beautiful," he would comment. "They must visit you often." "Not really," Margaret would sigh. "Christian comes maybe twice a year. Petra a little more. They have their own lives, you understand. Sometimes I feel like I'm a burden." Mehmet would shake his head with a sad expression. That makes me very sad. In Turkey, caring for your parents is sacred. You deserve much more attention. These conversations always left Margaret thoughtful and slightly melancholic, just as Mehmet had planned. He was mapping not only her financial situation, but also her emotional vulnerabilities, the loneliness, the feeling of abandonment by her children, the desperate need to feel loved and valued. In November, Mehmet began to implement the second phase of his plan. He started small. He borrowed €50 for important documents at City Hall. Margaret gave him the money without hesitation and was surprised when he returned it the following week with a small gift as a thank you. "You didn't have to pay it back so quickly," she said. "A man of honor always keeps his promises," Mehmet replied solemnly. "My father taught me that before he died." This strategy, borrowing small amounts and returning them quickly, continued for several weeks. Margaret began to see him as exceptionally trustworthy. When he finally asked for a larger sum, €300 for a vocational course that can help me get a job, she didn't hesitate for a second. "Of course, Mehmet, you're trying to rebuild your life. It's an investment in your future." This time, however, he did not return the money immediately. When Margaret asked discreetly, he explained that the course was longer than he had expected, but that he would pay everything back as soon as he got a job. "You trust me, don't you? Because I trust you completely. You're like my German mother." The word mother touched Margaret deeply. At that moment, she knew that Mehmet had become much more than just a guest. He was family. What she didn't know was that there was no course. Mehmet had used the money to buy better clothes and a more sophisticated phone. He needed to keep up appearances for the next stage of his plan. During this time, Mehmet also began to subtly isolate Margaret from her social contacts. When she mentioned plans to visit her friend Hannelore, he would make comments such as, "I'm sure she's a good person, but sometimes I feel that some people here don't like me because I'm a foreigner. I'm worried that they'll say bad things about me to you." Margaret protested that this was impossible, but Mehmet masterfully planted the seeds of doubt. "Maybe it's just my paranoia," he would say with a sad smile. "I've lost so much. Now I'm afraid of losing you too." Gradually, Margaret began to decline social invitations, preferring to stay home with Mehmet. He was so interesting. He knew so many fascinating stories about different cultures. Why go out when she could have such stimulating company at home? One November evening after dinner, Mehmet asked to have a serious conversation with her. "Frau Margarete," he began, with a solemn expression she had never seen before. "I need to tell you something that is very difficult for me." Margaret felt her heart race. "What is it, my dear?" "I found out that my wife, she didn't die in the explosion as I thought." His hands trembled slightly. "I got in touch with someone in Turkey. She's alive, in a very dangerous situation. She needs to leave the country urgently." Margaret was speechless. "But that's wonderful. You can be reunited with her." "Yes, but—" Mehmet hesitated, as if struggling with some painful decision. "I need money to bring her here. The middlemen are asking for a lot, and if I don't pay soon—" He left the sentence hanging. "How much?" Margaret asked immediately. €5,000, Mehmet replied, carefully watching her reaction. "I know it's a lot. I would never ask if it weren't a matter of life and death. I can pay you back as soon as she arrives and we find work." Margaret didn't hesitate for a second. "Of course. I'll go to the bank tomorrow." Mehmet hugged her with tears in his eyes, genuine tears, because he had finally reached the moment he had planned for since day one. "You're an angel," he whispered. "I don't know how to thank you." That night, Margaret slept with her heart full of joy, thinking about how wonderful it would be to have a young Turkish girl in her home, perhaps even Mehmet's little daughter. Her house would once again be filled with life, laughter, and movement. Mehmet, meanwhile, sent a coded message to his contacts. Phase 2 is complete. Starting Phase 3 tomorrow. The fish has completely taken the bait. What Margaret didn't know was that there was no wife. There was no daughter. There was no explosion. The whole story was an elaborate fabrication, told with convincing details that Mehmet had perfected with dozens of other victims in different European countries. In 2 months, he had turned an independent and cautious woman into a surrogate mother willing to make any sacrifice for her newly adopted family. And that was just the beginning. The next morning, Margaret went to Sparkasse Bank as promised. Herr Weber, her trusted manager for over 15 years, was clearly surprised when she requested a cash withdrawal of 5,000 euros. "That's a considerable amount, Frau Hoffmann," he said, adjusting his glasses. "May I ask what it's for?" Margareta hesitated for a moment. "It's to help someone, a family emergency." "I see. But wouldn't a bank transfer be safer? Carrying that much cash?" "No, it has to be cash," Margaret insisted, repeating exactly what Mehmet had instructed her to say. "It's complicated." Herr Weber watched her for a few seconds. Margaret had always been an exemplary conservative client who never made risky financial moves, but he couldn't refuse a legitimate request. "Very well, I'll prepare the money. Just please be careful." When Margaret arrived home with the envelope, Mehmet greeted her with an emotional hug that lasted several seconds longer than usual. "I can't believe you did this for me," he said with tears in his eyes. "You saved my family." At that moment, Margarete felt like the most important person in the world. What she didn't see was Mehmet secretly photographing the envelope of money with his hidden cell phone, sending the image to someone with the message, "Confirmed. The German woman is completely hooked. Next phase approved." In the days that followed, Mehmet began receiving urgent calls about his wife's situation. Margarete heard only one side of the conversations, always in Turkish, always dramatic. Mehmet spoke in an agitated tone, sometimes shouting, other times seeming to beg. "Problems?" Margaret asked, concerned. "The smugglers have raised the price," Mehmet explained, sounding exhausted. "They say the situation at the border has become more dangerous. Now they want 8,000 euros. Margaret felt a knot in her stomach. "But we already paid 5,000. "I know, Mehmet said, holding her hands. "Maybe I can negotiate. I'll try to get the money some other way. I can't ask any more of you." But Margaret saw the desperation in his eyes and knew he had no other options. "Mehmet, if it's to save your wife—" "No," he interrupted firmly. "You've already done too much. I'll find another way." This apparent resistance made Margaret insist even more. Over the next 48 hours, she could hardly sleep, thinking about the poor Turkish woman in danger. Finally, on a rainy December morning, she announced her decision. "I'll borrow another 3,000 euros against the house. That's what I can do quickly." Mehmet protested pro forma, but Margaret was adamant. "A human life is worth more than money," she said. "Werner always said that." While Margaret arranged the loan, Mehmet began introducing new elements into his story. He mentioned that he would need to travel to personally coordinate the rescue and that he might bring a trusted friend to help with the negotiations. "His name is Kemal," Mehmet explained. "He knows the safe routes. Without him, it would be impossible." A week later, when Margaret delivered the additional 3,000 euros, Mehmet announced that Kemal would be coming to visit them. "He needs to meet you, to understand that we are family. It will make the operation safer." Margaret agreed, eager to do whatever she could to help. What she didn't know was that Kemal was actually the coordinator of the criminal operation, a man who had orchestrated dozens of similar scams across Europe. Kemal arrived on a cold January afternoon, driving a sleek black BMW. He was older than Mehmet, perhaps 45, well-dressed, with a natural confidence that immediately impressed Margaret. He spoke German fluently, with only a slight accent. "Frau Hoffmann," he said, respectfully kissing her hand, "Mehmet told me about your infinite kindness. You Germans are truly special." During dinner, Kemal told fascinating stories about international business, demonstrated knowledge of German art, and praised the decor of Margaret's home. She was enchanted by his sophistication. "Mehmet is very lucky to have found you," Kemal said. "Unfortunately, our operation has become more complex. The Turkish authorities have discovered our previous network. We need to use more expensive but much safer routes." Margaret felt a chill. "More money?" "I'm afraid so," Kemal replied sadly. 15,000 euros in total. I know it's a lot, but I guarantee that your daughter-in-law will arrive here safe and sound." The word daughter-in-law made Margaret smile involuntarily. She had already begun to plan how she would welcome Mehmet's wife, where she would sleep, how she would help her integrate. That night, after Kemal left, Margaret made a confession that shocked even Mehmet. "I'm going to sell some family jewelry," she said. "My grandmother's emeralds, Werner's watch, they're just objects. A human life is more important." Mehmet pretended to protest, but inside he was celebrating. The operation was exceeding his most optimistic expectations. What neither of them realized was that Hannelore Richter, Margaret's neighbor, had noticed the unusual activity. She had seen Kemal's BMW, observed Margaret's frequent trips to the bank, and was beginning to suspect that something was not right. One morning in January, Hannelore rang the doorbell at Margaret's house. "Margaret, dear," she said, "I need to talk to you. It's about that Turkish man who's living here." But before she could continue, Mehmet appeared at the door, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Frau Richter," he said politely. "How nice to see you. Margaret was just commenting on what a wonderful neighbor you are." Hannelore looked from Mehmet to Margaret, sensing something wrong in the atmosphere, but unable to identify exactly what it was. "Maybe we'll talk another day," she said finally. After Hannelore left, Mehmet made a casual comment that planted another poisonous seed. "I noticed she seemed a little hostile. I hope it's not because of prejudice against foreigners." Margaret assured him that Hannelore wasn't like that, but a small doubt settled in her mind. Perhaps it would be better to keep Mehmet's situation more private, at least until his wife arrived. Thus, without realizing it, Margaret took another step into the social isolation that Mehmet had been carefully building around her. That night, Mehmet sent his daily update. "Operation progressing perfectly. Target isolated from support network. Next extraction, 15 to 20,000 euros. After that final phase." The reply came quickly. "Excellent work. Prepare for complete closure. Leave no traces." Margaret slept peacefully, dreaming of the day she would finally meet her new Turkish daughter. She had no idea that she was being systematically stripped of her life savings by a criminal network that had turned German hospitality into a lucrative science. And the worst was yet to come. Herbstlinden, February-March 2020. The first crack in Mehmet's perfect facade appeared on a cold February afternoon. Margaret had gone out to sell the family jewels at Goldberg's jewelry store in Hanover, a trip that was supposed to take all day. When she returned earlier than expected, the appraisal had been quicker than she had imagined. She found the front door open and unfamiliar voices coming from the living room. Margaret hesitated at the entrance, listening to a conversation in a language she did not recognize. It was not Turkish. She had already grown accustomed to that sound. It was something harsher, perhaps Arabic or Albanian. The voices were male, at least 3 different men, speaking in low but tense tones. "Mehmet," she called, announcing her presence. Immediately, silence fell in the house. Hurried footsteps, a door slamming, and then Mehmet appeared in the hallway with a smile that seemed forced for the first time since she had met him. "Margaret, you're back early," he said, visibly nervous. "How did it go with the jewelry?" "Mehmet, who were those people?" she asked, ignoring the question about the jewelry. "What people?" He tilted his head, feigning confusion. "I was just making some calls to Turkey. You know how it is. The signal is better when I use speakerphone." Margaret stared at him for a long moment. She was 73, but she was no fool. There had clearly been other people in the house, and now they had vanished like smoke. "Mehmet," she said calmly, "don't lie to me. I heard at least 3 different voices. Where are they?" Mehmet's smile faltered. For a second, Margaret saw something in his eyes she had never seen before, a coldness that made her instinctively recoil. "Margaret," he said, regaining his composure, "you're imagining things. Maybe it's the stress of this whole situation with my wife. Let's have some tea and talk about the jewelry." But Margaret couldn't forget the incident. That night, for the first time in months, she called her daughter Petra. "Petra, dear," she began hesitantly, "I need to tell you something about Mehmet." "What is it, Mom? Did something happen?" Margarete recounted the incident with the voices, but as she spoke she realized how paranoid she sounded. Petra listened patiently, but her response was exactly what Margaret had feared. "Mom, are you sure you weren't just tired? Maybe it was voices from the TV or from neighbors." "No, Petra, I know what I heard." "Okay, Mom, but look, I'll come visit you at the end of the month. We can talk about this in person, okay?" After she hung up, Margaret felt even more isolated. Not even her own daughter believed her. In the days that followed, Mehmet seemed more attentive than ever, as if he felt he needed to make up for lost ground. He brought flowers every day, cooked special Turkish dishes, and spent hours telling stories from his childhood that made Margaret laugh. She was almost convinced that she had imagined everything, almost. The second incident happened a week later. Margaret woke up at 2 in the morning thirsty and went down to the kitchen to get some water. As she passed through the living room, she noticed a dim light coming from Werner's office, a small room she rarely used. The door was ajar, and through the crack she could see Mehmet sitting at the computer. Curious, she approached quietly. Mehmet was typing rapidly, and on the screen she could see numbers, lots of numbers, organized in columns that looked like financial spreadsheets. He was speaking softly on the phone, in a language that was definitely not Turkish. Margaret held her breath and managed to catch a few words in English. "Transfer completed. Next target. Elderly woman in Stuttgart." Her blood ran cold. She backed away carefully, returned to her room, and spent the rest of the night awake, trying to process what she had heard. Target, elderly woman. The next morning, Mehmet was his usual self, making coffee and asking how she had slept. Margaret watched him carefully, looking for signs of dishonesty, but he seemed genuinely concerned about her well-being. "You look tired, Margaret. Didn't you sleep well?" "I did," she lied. "Mehmet, can I ask you a question?" "Sure, anything." "Why were you using the computer in the middle of the night?" This time, the pause was longer. Mehmet took a sip of coffee, clearly stalling for time. "Time difference," he finally said. "It was the only time I could talk to my contacts in Turkey about my wife. I didn't want to wake you up." "And why in English?" Mehmet stopped drinking his coffee. "What do you mean?" "I heard you speaking English. Why not Turkish?" The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but to Margaret it seemed like an eternity. When Mehmet spoke again, his voice had a slightly different tone, still friendly, but with an underlying firmness she had never noticed before. "Margaret, I know you're worried, but you need to trust me. Some of these conversations are complicated. They involve people from different countries, different languages. Sometimes I need to speak English so that everyone understands." "I understand," said Margaret, but her voice sounded uncertain even to herself. Mehmet stood up and walked over to her, placing his hands on her shoulders with a gentleness that now seemed slightly theatrical. "Margaret, you're like a mother to me. I would never do anything to hurt you. You believe me, don't you?" Margaret looked him in the eye. She wanted to believe him. She had invested so much emotionally and financially in this relationship that accepting that it was all a lie seemed impossible. "Of course I believe you," she whispered. But for the first time since September, a small voice in her head began to whisper doubts that she could no longer completely ignore. That afternoon, while Mehmet was at German class, Margaret did something she hadn't done in months. She visited Hannelore. "Margaret!" exclaimed her neighbor, clearly surprised. "How nice to see you! It's been so long!" "Hannelore," Margaret said hesitantly, "can I ask you a strange question?" "Of course, dear. Come in. Let's have some coffee." Sitting in Hannelore's cozy kitchen, Margaret finally asked, Have you noticed any strange movements in my house? Different people?" Hannelore almost choked on her coffee. "Why do you ask?" "Just curious." Hannelore hesitated, clearly debating with herself whether she should speak. Finally, she sighed. "Margareta, I didn't want to worry you, but yes, I've seen different cars several times. Always at night, always with men who didn't look like needy refugees. And there's something else." "What?" "My nephew works at Sparkasse Bank. He mentioned, without giving details because of confidentiality, but he said you've been making a lot of large transactions lately. He was concerned." Margaret felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. "Margaret," Hannelore continued gently, "you're being careful, aren't you? With the money, I mean." For the first time in months, Margaret told someone the whole truth. She told her about Mehmet's wife, about the 15,000 euros, about the jewelry she had sold. Hannelore listened in growing horror. "Mein Gott, Margaret," she whispered when the story was over. "You need to go to the police, now." "But what if I'm wrong? What if he really is?" "What if you're right?" Hannelore interrupted. "Margaret, promise me one thing. Don't give him any more money. Not a single euro. Not until we've looked into this properly." Margaret nodded, but when she returned home and saw Mehmet preparing dinner, humming a Turkish song under his breath, all her doubts seemed to dissolve again. "How was your day, Margaret?" he asked with that warm smile that had won her heart 6 months ago. "It was good," she lied, forcing a smile. But that night, for the first time since September, Margarete locked her bedroom door. The change in Mehmet's behavior was subtle at first, but Margaret began to notice it with disturbing clarity. He began asking more direct questions about her finances, inquiring about other bank accounts, investments, the deed to the house. When she hesitated to answer, he frowned with an expression that was no longer one of affectionate concern, but of thinly veiled impatience. "Margaret," he said one March morning as she was making coffee, "I need to ask you something important. Do you have other savings, maybe accounts at other banks?" "Why do you want to know that?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "It's about my wife," he replied, but this time the explanation sounded rehearsed. "The smugglers are asking for additional guarantees. They want to know that we have resources for emergencies." Margaret felt a chill in her stomach. "Mehmet, we've already given them more than 15,000 euros. How much more are they going to ask for?" For the first time, Mehmet lost his patience. "Margaret, you don't understand how these things work," he exploded, slamming his hand on the table. "It's not about money, it's about saving a human life." The shout echoed through the kitchen. Margaret recoiled, genuinely frightened. In 6 months of living together, he had never raised his voice to her. "I'm sorry," Mehmet said immediately, returning to his soft tone, but Margrethe noticed that his eyes remained cold. "It's just, I'm very stressed. I feel like I'm losing my wife again." That afternoon, while Mehmet was out, Margrethe did something she hadn't had the courage to do for weeks. She called Christian in Hamburg. "Son," she said bluntly, "I need you to come visit me, now." "Mom, has something happened? You sound—" "Christian, please, I can't explain over the phone. Can you come this weekend?" Something in the tone of her voice alarmed Christian. "Sure, Mom, I'll be there Friday night." When Margrethe hung up, she felt relieved for the first time in months, but her sense of relief was short-lived. Mehmet had come home and was standing in the kitchen doorway, watching her with an expression she had never seen before. "Who were you talking to?" he asked. "Christian. He's coming to visit us this weekend." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Mehmet walked slowly toward her, and Margrethe instinctively backed away. "Margrethe," he said, his voice low but with an underlying threatening tone, "I hope you didn't say anything inappropriate about our situation." "Inappropriate?" "About my wife, about the money. Some people might not understand our special family." The word family sounded different now. Not warm, but possessive, territorial. "Of course not," Margrethe lied. "I just said you were living here." Mehmet studied her for a long moment, as if deciding whether to believe her. Finally he nodded. "Good. It would be unfortunate if Christian got the wrong impression about me." That night, Margrethe heard Mehmet on the phone again. This time, she deliberately went downstairs to listen. He was speaking in English, in an urgent tone. "She's becoming suspicious. Son visiting Friday. Might need to accelerate timeline. Yes, I understand the risks." Margrethe backed away quietly, but a floorboard creaked under her feet. The conversation stopped abruptly. "Margrethe!" Mehmet called. "Are you there?" "I just came to get some water," she replied, forcing her voice to sound natural. On Thursday, the day before Christian's arrival, Mehmet announced that Kemal would be returning for an urgent meeting about his wife. "He needs you to sign some documents," Mehmet said, "to speed up the process." "What kind of documents?" "Guarantee documents. To show the smugglers that you support the operation." Something about the word guarantee set off all the alarms in Margaret's head. "Mehmet, I'm not signing anything until Christian gets here. He understands these legal issues better." Mehmet's mask finally slipped completely. His eyes narrowed, and his voice took on an icy tone that made her shiver. "Margrethe, you will sign these documents today. You owe me that." "And I don't owe you anything," she replied, surprising herself with her own firmness. Mehmet took a step toward her, and for the first time, Margrethe felt real physical fear. "You don't understand the situation you've gotten yourself into," he said slowly. "There are people involved in this who don't like it when plans are interrupted." "Are you threatening me?" "I'm protecting you," he replied, but the tone was clearly threatening. "Consequences you can't even imagine." At that moment, Margrethe knew with absolute certainty that it had all been a lie. There was no wife, there was no rescue. There was only a predator who had invaded her life and now refused to leave. "Get out of my house!" she said, her voice trembling but determined. Mehmet laughed, a humorless sound that made her flinch. "Your house? Margrethe, you don't understand. I'm not leaving, and neither are you." That's when Margrethe realized he was blocking the kitchen door. The windows were closed, and he stood between her and any escape route. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. "First, you go to the bank tomorrow and withdraw all the money from your main account. Then we'll take a trip to meet some friends of mine. They have interesting proposals for a lady in your financial situation." Margrethe realized with horror that he wasn't just stealing her money. He was planning to kidnap her. "What if I refuse?" Mehmet took a cell phone out of his pocket and showed her a photo that made her blood run cold. It was Christian leaving his building in Hamburg, clearly taken that morning. "Your son has a very predictable routine," Mehmet said casually. "Every morning, 7:15 a.m., walk to the subway. Always alone. It would be a shame if something happened to him." Margaret felt as if the world were collapsing around her. You're not a refugee." "Very perceptive," Mehmet laughed. "I am, in fact, part of a very successful operation. You are our 13th German client this year. All mature, lonely women with substantial financial resources. The others, what happened to them? That depends entirely on how cooperative they were." Margaret closed her eyes, trying to think. Christian would arrive in 24 hours, if she could buy some time. "All right," she said, feigning defeat. "I'll do whatever you want, but I need time to organize my finances. Some investments are tied up." Mehmet studied her suspiciously. "How much time?" "Until Monday. 3 days." "You have until Sunday," he said finally. "And, Margaret, don't try anything clever. My colleagues are watching Christian, and also your daughter Petra in Munich. It would be very sad if our little family had an accident." That night, Margaret locked herself in the bathroom and called the police on her cell phone, whispering into the receiver. "Police! My name is Margaret Hoffmann, Lindenstrasse 47 in Herbst-Linden. I am being held captive by a man who pretended to be a refugee. He threatened my children. Please, you have to come, but discreetly. He may be armed." The operator asked her to stay on the line, but Margaret heard footsteps in the hallway. "I can't talk any more," she whispered. "Please come quickly." When she left the bathroom, Mehmet was waiting for her in the hallway, with an expression that made her realize he might have heard part of the conversation. "Everything okay out there, Margaret?" he asked, his voice dangerously soft. "Sure," she replied, trying to get past him. Mehmet blocked her way. "You know, I've been thinking. Maybe it would be better if we changed our plans. A little trip. Tonight." Margaret knew that time was up. Mehmet suspected that she had called for help. Now it was a race against time. Would the police arrive first, or would Mehmet get her out of the house before they could find her? As he forced her to pack her bags, Margaret prayed silently that someone, anyone, would arrive in time. Outside, distant sirens began to wail in the German night. Herbst-Linden, March 2020. The sirens were getting closer as Mehmet forced Margaret to put the last piece of clothing in her suitcase. His movements were tense, calculated, but she could see the panic growing in his eyes. "Hurry!" he said, gripping her arm too tightly. "We have to go out the back door, now." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Margaret declared, surprising them both with her firmness. Mehmet stared at her for a moment, then pulled a knife from the kitchen drawer. "Margaret, you don't understand. It's no longer a choice." That's when the blue and red lights began flashing through the front windows. Mehmet cursed, in a language Margaret didn't recognize, and ran to the back window. "Polizei! Open the door!" The amplified voice echoed through the house. Mehmet looked around frantically, clearly searching for an escape route. Margaret took advantage of his distraction to run toward the front door. "I'm here!" she shouted. "He's armed!" Mehmet managed to reach her before she got to the door, grabbing her by the arm. "You shouldn't have done that," he whispered, and for the first time Margaret saw true hatred in his eyes. The front door blew in. 3 police officers entered with guns drawn, followed by a negotiator. "Drop the weapon! Hands up!" Mehmet hesitated for a second that seemed like an eternity. Margaret felt the blade of the knife pressing lightly against her ribs. Then he simply pushed her toward the officers and ran to the back of the house. Margaret fell to the floor, but she was unharmed. The officers surrounded her protectively, while others ran after Mehmet. Through the back window, she could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness of the garden. Frau Hoffmann? The negotiator knelt beside her. Are you hurt? No, Margaret managed to say, trembling. He's not a refugee. He's part of a gang. There are other victims. 15 minutes later, one of the officers returned, clearly frustrated. He got away, he announced. He knew the terrain. He must have planned escape routes. In the days that followed, the investigation revealed the shocking scale of Mehmet's operation. His real name was Arkan Petrovic, a 38-year-old Serbian with police records in 6 European countries. His Turkish refugee identity had been completely fabricated. Kemal, whose real name was Dragan Milic, was the coordinator of a network that had been operating for more than 5 years, specifically targeting lonely elderly women in small German towns. They chose their targets through social networks, public records, and local observation. The investigation uncovered at least 15 other victims in Germany alone. Some had lost their entire savings. 2 elderly women had been forced to sell their homes. One had suffered a nervous breakdown and was admitted to a psychiatric clinic. Their method was always the same, Detective Commissar Fischer explained to Margaret during her testimony. They would introduce themselves as refugees, gain trust, and invent family emergencies that required money. When the victim began to suspect something, they would simply disappear and move on to the next town. What about the money? Margaret asked. My 15,000 euros? Fischer hesitated. We found some bank accounts, but unfortunately most of it has already been transferred to tax havens. We've managed to recover about 4,000 euros so far. 4,000 out of 15,000. Margaret felt a mixture of relief and despair. It was something, but it wasn't enough to cover even the loan she had taken out against her house. The police operation resulted in the arrest of Kemal, Dragan, and 2 other accomplices, but Mehmet Arkan remained at large. There were indications that he had fled to Serbia, where extradition would be complex and time-consuming. Cases like this are frustratingly common, Fischer admitted. International criminal networks that specifically exploit German hospitality. They know our legal system. They know how to exploit bureaucratic loopholes. 6 months later, Margaret still lived in the same house on Lindenstrasse. But everything had changed. She had installed a security system, changed all the locks, and rarely had visitors. The trust that had taken 73 years to build had been destroyed in a matter of days. Christian and Petra took turns visiting her more often, but Margrethe could see the constant concern in their eyes. They had gently suggested that she consider moving to an assisted living facility, just to be on the safe side. I'm not an invalid, she insisted, but deep down she knew she was no longer the same independent and confident person she had been before. Hannelore became her most frequent visitor, bringing newspapers and local gossip, trying to maintain some normality. But even these visits were marked by an underlying melancholy. You saved several other women, Hannelore often reminded her. If you hadn't called the police, they would have continued. It was true. Kemal's arrest had led to the dismantling of at least part of the network. Other investigations were underway in France, Austria, and the Netherlands. But that didn't bring back the lost money or repair the psychological trauma. What hurt Margaret the most was the complete betrayal of trust. Every affectionate gesture, every thank you, every "you are like my German mother" had been calculated, staged, part of an elaborate performance. How can I trust anyone again? She asked the psychologist Christian, had insisted she see. It's a process, Dr. Meyer replied gently. Trust trauma is a real wound that needs time to heal. A year later, Mehmet Arkan was still on the run. There were unconfirmed reports that he was operating in Poland or the Czech Republic, always with new identities, always looking for new, vulnerable victims. Kemal Dragan was sentenced to 6 years in prison, but with the possibility of parole in 4. The other accomplices received shorter sentences. To Margaret, it seemed insufficient considering the lives they had destroyed. The house on Lindenstrasse never felt the same again. The room where Mehmet had slept remained closed. Margaret had donated all the furniture and repainted the walls, but she could still feel his presence there. On her lonely nights, she sometimes wondered about the other victims. How many women like her were at that moment opening their doors to predators disguised as needy refugees? How many stories of lost wives were being told in other German kitchens? The bitter irony was that Margaret had started it all by wanting to help someone in genuine need. Her hospitality, her kindness, her best human qualities had been turned into weapons against her. "What saddens me most," she confessed to Hannelore one fall afternoon, "is that now, when I see a real refugee on the street, a person who genuinely needs help, I feel afraid. They robbed me not only of my money, but also of my ability to be kind." Hannelore held her hand silently. There were no words that could repair this kind of damage. In little Herbst Linden, Margaret's case became an urban legend. Neighbors whispered about always checking documents and never trusting strangers. Traditional German hospitality had been tainted by fear, and somewhere in Europe, Mehmet Arkan was probably ringing the doorbell of another house with a new name, a new tragic story, and the same warm smile that had won Margaret over that September afternoon. Justice had been partial, recovery incomplete, and predators like him continued to hunt, knowing that there would always be kind people willing to help and pay the price for their humanity.